Today, I will introduce to you some of the topics related to my PhD research, which is about cardiovascular modeling for the early detection of coronary artery disease. So to give you a bit of context about my research, we are talking about cardiovascular disease, which is the leading cause of mortality worldwide. Among cardiovascular disease, we concentrate on coronary artery disease, which affect those arteries in charge of bringing oxygenated blood to the heart. Here, there is a tendency of fat to deposit into those arteries so they can get occluded, and this may lead to a blockage and then heart failure. So when this happens, the most common surgical treatment is called bypass grafting, where some arteries or veins are taken from the patients and they're used to bypass the blockage so that the blood can still perfuse the heart. However, data show that up to 60% of grafts fail to work some years after surgery. And the reasons behind such failures today are still unknown. So what we want to do is to use computational fluid dynamics to investigate the mechanisms behind graft failures. As you can imagine, this problem is quite complex, so there are many steps and many actors that come into play. In particular, we need to do a recruitment phase where we recruit patients, and on this patient, then some surgeons, some doctors will perform the surgery to do bypass grafting. Approximately 1 month and then 1 year after the surgery, some medical imaging is performed on those patients by radiologists, so that data are gathered and they can be sent to us, so to engineers that perform CFD modeling. Once we have our cardiovascular models, we can then get back to doctors so that they can evaluate the clinical value of our results, the clinical aspect, the relevance of our results. So in our specific case for our project, we collaborate with the Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto and the St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, who take care both of the recruitment, the surgery, and the medical imaging phase. While for the CFD modeling, we collaborate actively with the University of Toronto and with the International School of Advanced Studies in Trieste. So you may ask, how can we go from like the sick patient to the cardiovascular model? So once we have the patient, we can perform, as I said, some medical imaging on him or her. So usually we do CT scan and so computed tomography scan, and also what is called a 4D flow MRI, which is a particular type of magnetic resonance imaging. From the data we gather through medical imaging, we are able to reconstruct a 3D model of the vessels of interest. And on this 3D model, we can then build a mesh, tetrahedral mesh, so that we're able to use finite element modeling to solve some equations that describe the motion of fluids, also of blood, into our vessels. In particular, these equations are Stokes equations or Navier-Stokes equations. The use of mathematical model is really powerful because once we solve it, we can retrieve both velocity and pressure point-wise in our domain. So we know exactly in each point of our vessel, which is the velocity of the blood, which is the pressure. And this allows us to compute afterwards some quantities, some indicators that tells us how the graft is working, how the blood is flowing, and so to make some consideration on the performance of the graft and its possible failure. So this is the state-of-the-art pipeline, but there are still some steps here that need further investigation, that need further research. One of this is in the mathematical model phase. In fact, when we set a mathematical model, we have to choose what are called boundary conditions. It's in this step that we can take inspiration and help from circuit modeling to model what is happening outside our 3D model, our 3D domain. However, this phase of setting the boundary condition is crucial and also really delicate, because if boundary conditions are not set properly, they have a huge influence on the results of our model, and they can screw up our entire simulation. So our results are not accurate at all. So what we're trying to do, what we're trying to address, is how to choose the best boundary conditions that make our cardiovascular model as accurate as possible. So some details about boundary conditions, so what they are, why do we need them. When we solve partial differential equation problems, we need to set boundary conditions to end up with a unique solution of the problem. And also boundary conditions have they need to model whatever happens outside our domain of interest. So here we have like an aortic arch. This is the aorta, and we have the supraaortic branches as well. What we set usually it's an inlet boundary condition, which is usually it's a velocity because we know the inlet profile, the velocity profile, so how the blood enters our domain. Then we set what is called the wall boundary condition. So we impose the velocity to be 0 on the walls of the vessels because blood like sticks to the walls and it's still there. And then we have to set the outlet boundary conditions. And here we have different possibilities. Either we can fix the pressure or the velocity at the outlet, and it is called Dirichlet boundary condition. So we prescribe certain value of pressure or velocity, or we can impose what is called the Neumann boundary condition, where we impose a certain value for the stress. And this is equivalent as modeling the discharge of blood into reservoir. Another possibility that is quite interesting is instead using lumped parameter network. We can do this because we can exploit the well-known analogy between the hydraulic domain and the electric domain. In fact, if we find an analogy between pressure in the hydraulic domain and voltage in the electric domain, as well as between flow rate and current, we can also find sort of duals for the main electric quantities, such as resistance, inductance, and capacitance, but in the hydraulic domain. The resistance, for example, can be compared to blood viscosity, so it's something that prevents our blood from flowing easily. Inductance is like blood inertia, so something that the ability that blood has to flow even in absence of pressure. And capacitance instead is like wall compliance, so the ability that vessel walls have to enlarge in order to accommodate more blood. This means that we can set as boundary conditions some simple circuit, for example, a simple resistance or an RRC circuit on an RC circuit, and this allows us to model much more precisely what's happening outside our domain. However, this brings another problem. So how do we choose the values for such resistances and capacitances? And this problem is far from trivial. One idea is to use some patient-specific measurements, so some data that we have directly from our patient to help us to guide us into choosing those values. So this leads us to the second problem that I'm introducing in the initial pipeline, and it's connected to medical imaging. So as I told you, we perform a CT scan that allows us to know exactly how the vessels of our patients are built, so we can reconstruct them in 3D, but we also perform what is called the 4D flow MRI. And this type of magnetic resonance imaging allows us to know both the temporal and the spatial evolution of blood into our domain. So we know how blood is flowing in time and in space. This is a lot of information, a lot of powerful information that we would like to introduce into our mathematical model to make it as close as possible to what's really happening inside our patient. So our second question is, how can we assimilate those patient-specific data into our model to make it as accurate as possible? And this problem is taken care of by a whole mathematical branch that is called data assimilation. And what data assimilation does is exactly this. So it finds a process, it's a process of finding like the model representation that best suits a set of data, what's called the observation. And so in order to properly do the data assimilation, we start from a set of patient-specific data, what is called observation, and through an assimilation process, we introduce those data into our mathematical model, so that in the end, our model will give improved results that are close to reality. To give you a bit more detail about the type of data we have in our projects, they come from this cutting-edge technology is really advanced. It's a new type of magnetic resonance called 4D flow MRI, and as you can see, we know it's called 4D flow because we know both the 3D spatial evolution, but also the temporal evolution. So it's in 4 dimension, and we can reconstruct the blood flow of inside all our domain, so our region of interest. There are different techniques to do data simulation. For example, you can use a Kalman filter, but what we decided to use is optimal control, the optimal control problem. So to introduce you to optimal control, we start with a really simple example that is called the rocket car example. Assume we have a rocket car in the point A in space at time equal to 0. And on this rocket car, we can impose a thrust, so a force that we call U, that is variable in both direction, and it's bounded. And what we want to do is that for the rocket car to reach point B in space in time capital T. So this is the data we have at our available. And the question we're trying to answer is, what is the minimal time, capital T, that the rockets need to reach point B? So this seems really trivial example, and it is, but we can recast it in a different way so that it's a simple optimal control problem. In fact, this problem can be reformulated in this way. So minimize the time t subject to the following constraint. And we have the equation of motion, we have the position and the velocity of the rocket at the beginning, the position and the velocity at the end, and we have a constraint on the force on the thrust. So what we have precisely is a cost functional that we're trying to minimize, and this cost functional is constrained to a set of differential equation. In this case, is initial value problem. And we then have what is called a control function, which is a variable that we can change in order to for the problem to reach the minimum. So it's the variable we can act on. And then we have a set of additional constraints. So even if this example is really easy, it's trivial, it's actually an optimal control, because the basic ingredients that we have in order for a problem to be an optimal control problem is to have a cost functional to be minimized that is constrained to a set of differential equations, usually partial differential equations. And you also always need a control function. So what we decided to use is to use optimal control to tackle both the problems that I introduced to you before. So for assimilating data coming from 4D flow MRI, but also for selecting automatically the outlet resistive boundary conditions. So what I'm solving, as I told you, is still an optimal control problem. So we'll have a cost functional that I'm trying to minimize, which will be constrained to a set of state equation. In my case, is Stokes equations, which model the motion of blood into our vessels. In this case, I'm working on the aortic arch. And I will reach the minimum by changing control functions, U. In this case, the control functions are the resistances used as the outlet boundary conditions. How am I able to assimilate data into, thanks to optimal control problem? Well, you can see the answer in the cost functional. So my cost functional is the difference between, I'm trying to minimize the norm of the difference between the velocity, which is the state variable coming from Stokes, the Stokes solution, and the 4D flow MRI data, so the velocities that I measured on my patient. And I'm also minimizing the difference between the Stokes pressure, the variable coming from Stokes equation, and the average pressure that we measured from the patients. So what this optimal control problem is able to do is at the same time inserting assimilating data coming from the patient, so that the Stokes solution that will be chosen for our problem will be the one as close as possible to the patient-specific data. At the same time, the optimal control will choose automatically the control variable, so the resistive, the outlet boundary condition. So I'm not left with the choice, the problem of choosing boundary conditions. in a clinical setting nowadays, in fact, what is done is to do a manual tuning in order to choose the resistances at the outlet. So there is an operator that knows the values of, for example, velocities in the patients, and it changes the resistances accordingly, simulating over and over again Navier-Stokes problem or Stokes problem until the solutions match the data coming from the patient. So in this way, instead, the selection is automated. I can show you some results of this tool that we propose. You have here the pressure that is coming out of the optimal control and the velocity. And the data that I'm assimilating is the average pressure measured all over my domain, and then the flow rates measured at the outlet of the supraortic branches. So where I'm also trying to impose to find the resistive boundary conditions. To give you more quantitative data, here you have the patient measurement, so what the pressure that we measured on the patient, and then the flow rates at the outlet. And you see how the controlled values in the second row are really close to the measurement. So the relative error is always less than 10%. This means that our optimal control problem is correctly assimilating data, measurement data. As a reference, I also reported here the values that you would reach using manual tuning, and you see how far you would be with respect to patient measurements. So there's a convenience in using optimal control. And as a reference here, also I reported the values of the resistive boundary condition that you would choose with manual tuning versus the one that optimal control chooses for you. So to conclude, what's next on this project, we want to apply this optimal control tool on coronary artery bypass grafts. I only showed it to you on the aortic arch, and there are some challenges in bringing this tool on the grafts. Since the grafts are really small, there are not a lot of measurements there, but we're hopeful that it will work out. And we want also to speed up simulation using reduced order modeling. Another project I'm working on, which I didn't present today, is how can we set boundary conditions where instead of the measurements that we have are really noisy or corrupted, or we don't have any measurements at all. And in this case, we propose to use technique based only on a minimum energy principle, so no data involved. So thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask or write me an email.
Thank you very much, Elisa. We already have 3 questions. So I go with the first one. How do you plan to enhance the reliability of the bypass grafts?
Oh, okay. So, the final goal of my PhD is not to make grafts more reliable. I don't have this type of claim. It's just more on the modeling part, and to make the modeling as accurate as possible. And then hopefully from the results we have, the analysis we have on the grafts 1 year and 1 month after surgery, like our goal is to make the modeling accurate, and then our doctors, our colleagues, can work on making the grafts more working better, hopefully.
Thank you very much. Second question, which is the advantage of employing an electrical model to represent the problem?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, using a circuit instead of using just prescribing the velocity or the pressure at the outlet, it's much more realistic because it models better what's happening inside our body. So if you use a resistance, for example, you're not saying the pressure is a certain value or the velocity is a certain value at the outlet, but you're just prescribing a relationship between pressure and blood at the outlet, and that's more similar to what's happening inside our body. And if you can insert also a capacitance, for example, you can also model how the blood vessels enlarge and restrict with the beating, the heart beating. So that's why it's more realistic.
Okay. And the last question, how many patients have been selected for the data processing?
Okay, so the entire project in the Sunnybrook Hospital and University of Toronto has a total of 30 patients. that have been like they had surgery and then they had CT and MRI done 1 month after surgery and 1 year after surgery. And yeah, we plan on using the whole cohort if possible, so around 30 patients.
Okay, I see there is another new question. Are there any cases where data simulation leads to worse results?
For what I experienced, no. Like it's when data coming from patients are so rare and so precious in this type of situation that they're really it's always convenient to insert those data into our model, and for sure it will be more close to reality. We don't have a lot of guidance into what's happening inside the human body in this sense. So if we have more data, usually it leads to more accurate solutions.